So good morning, everybody, and I'll skip right ahead. I'm very excited to be here today to speak to you about the topic that I have brought with me. You could call this an Austrian dilemma, maybe more than a geographical dilemma as a whole. I would love to speak to you today about restrictions to the free movement of workers. So the presentation will be structured in the following way. Firstly, I would quickly highlight the fundamental freedom of free movement of workers and show how the concept of a restriction ties in with Article 45 TFEU. Next, I will explore two possible justifications of the restriction to free movement, and then I would like to present to you two recent judgments of the European Court of Justice and their impact on the system that I will describe to you. So the principle of free movement of workers, as I'm sure that you are well aware, is laid down in Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, or TFEU in short. And as you can see from the slide, paragraph 1 provides that the freedom of movement has to be secured within the European Union. Paragraph 2 then provides a prohibition on discrimination, and this encompasses direct as well as indirect discrimination. And in paragraph 3, you will then find possible justifications for an indirect discrimination to the free movement of workers. So the same article you can also graphically represent, and then it would look something like this. And around the mid-1990s, a number of cases were brought before the European Court of Justice that, applying only this system set out in Article 45, were found to be non-discriminatory. However, these national measures were at the same time found to effectively hinder market access from foreign nationals into a member state of the European Union. And therefore, jurisdiction broadened the scope of Article 45, so we're moving away from what's written in the article itself, and is applying the system to these kinds of measures as well. And this is what we now describe as the so-called restrictions to the free movement of workers. And in order to highlight this institution further and also to outline its possible outer limits, I would like to highlight two cases from the European Court of Justice, starting with the well-known judgment in the famous Bosman ruling. So Jean-Marc Bosman is a Belgian national. He was a soccer player, he still is a soccer player, and he was employed by a Belgian first division football club. And when his contract ended, he sought to take up employment in France with a French football club. However, the receiving French club was confronted with transfer fees, which were imposed by the national and international football associations. And those transfer fees were found to be non-discriminatory because they applied to players irrespective of the nationality of the player, and they also applied every single time when one player decided to switch teams and move to another team. However, the European Court of Justice found that Mr. Bosman was nonetheless effectively prevented from securing employment in France, and therefore found this transfer fee system to be violating Article 45. So this is the first time, at least in the context of labor law and of free movement of workers, that the European Court of Justice applied the system of a restriction to free movement. And the possible outer limits have been explained to us by the European Court of Justice in the Graz judgment. So this is an Austrian case. And the phrasing that is very important is that the European Court of Justice said a national measure that is too uncertain and indirect to hinder the freedom of movement of workers cannot violate Article 45. So in the case at hand, just quickly explained, we were looking at the so-called compensation on termination of employment. So this is a lump sum of money that is being paid out to employees in Austria at the end of the employment relationship, but only in the case that the employer chooses to end the contract. And we had an Austrian national, Mr. Graf. He wanted to move from Austria to Germany. And he said that the fact that this lump sum of money might not be paid out to him because of his move, is effectively hindering his market access to the German employment market. And in this case, the European Court of Justice said, well, this compensation on termination only applies at the end of the employment relationship. It does not always apply, only if the employer chooses to terminate the contract. And therefore, this national measure, once again, is too uncertain and indirect to hinder the free movement of workers. And this reasoning is still being employed today whenever the European Court of Justice has to decide whether a certain non-discriminatory national measure constitutes a restriction to the free movement of workers. I would also like to point out that a found restriction to the free movement may be justified using the same possible grounds as with indirect discrimination. So those are the justifications which are laid down in Article 45, para 3 TFEU. Therefore, a restriction to the free movement of workers can be justified when it pursues one of the legitimate objectives listed in the treaty, or if it serves an overriding reason in the public interest, if it's necessary as well as proportionate. And today I would to highlight two possible justifications for such a restriction to the free movement, which are regularly invoked in the case law of the European Court of Justice. The first one, as you can see on the slide, is called company loyalty, and the idea here is that a national measure wants to reward employees for the loyalty to a particular employer. So this could be that they receive a higher remuneration if they choose to stay with the same employer for a certain amount of time. And the European Court of Justice has already stated in his case law that company loyalty may justify a restriction or also a discrimination to the free movement of workers. Then the second possible justification that I have prepared is the recognition of previous professional experience. So this is basically where my research interest lies primarily. The idea behind this justification is that a national measure is offering certain advantages to employees who already have some work experience in the field. So once again, for example, if you come to a new employer and you already have work experience that is relevant for this employer, the employee may be awarded a higher remuneration right off from the start. And once again, the European Court of Justice has already found that recognition of previous professional experience may be a justification to restriction to free movement. It constitutes a legitimate objective of pay policy. So after this general introduction, I would like to turn toward two recent judgments of the European Court of Justice, starting with the case Graz versus the University of Vienna. So excuse me, there's something popped up on the screen. Thank you. No worries. So in the case at hand, we have Dr. Adelheid Graz. She's a German national and she has been working at the University of Vienna as a senior lecturer for quite some time. And then an internal regulation of the University of Vienna was brought into place. And the University of Vienna decided to recognize relevant previous professional experience by awarding these employees with a higher remuneration. However, Dr. Graz found that not all relevant work experience was being recognized by the university. Instead of, I think she had another 8 times at the University of Vienna and 5.5 years at the University of Munich. So more than 10 years of relevant work experience, and only 3 of those were being recognized. So before we jump right into the judgment, I would just like to quickly point out to you this system of provisions that is working or that is being put into place. So at the Austrian level, this is basically the kind of pyramid of different legal provisions and how they are coming together. And on the one hand, we have the collective agreement for university staff. This is the industry level, and obviously it applies to all university employees. And in the collective agreement, the remuneration for university staff is being laid down. And then we have the internal regulation of the University of Vienna that I have already mentioned. This is obviously at company level. And within this regulation, the University of Vienna decided to award a higher remuneration only to those employees who have work experience. So once again, this is a different approach of explaining the system. So here you have the wording of the collective agreement and then also visual representation. So this means university staff, senior lecturers, they usually, if they start employment at an Austrian university, they start out within the first so-called pay step. So they are awarded 2,900 euros. And as they advance with the years with the same employer, they are being awarded a higher remuneration. And as you can see, the last possible pay steps would be 4,500 euros, so it's quite a difference in payment that they get. And the internal regulation of the university led to the fact that Dr. Graz was immediately being put into the third possible pay step. However, she argued that the correct classification, so recognizing all previous professional experience, would have immediately placed her in the last of those 5 pay steps. And as you can see for her, as you can see in this example, it makes quite a difference in remuneration for her. So the European Court, once again, before I'm too quickly, just for clarity's sake, the legal provision contained in the in the collective agreement, could be described or could be named the seniority rule, because we are awarding higher remuneration the longer the employment relationship lasts. And then we have another provision, which is the internal regulation of the university, and this we could name past experience rule, because we are recognizing previous professional experience. And the European Court of Justice was asked to decide 2 different questions. The first one being, and I'm quickly summarizing those 2 questions, is Article 45 TFEU violated if a provision, namely the internal regulation, only recognizes limited periods of previous professional experience, irrespective of where this experience was accumulated? The second question is a system that does not provide full recognition of previous professional experience, but at the same time links a higher remuneration to the duration of employment with the same employer, violating Article 45. So once again, I just want to make this clear again. In Austria, we do not have to recognize previous professional experience at all. And what the University of Vienna did here was it was supposed to serve an incentive for researchers from abroad to come to Vienna and offering them a higher remuneration. So this was something very good that was happening at the university and unique. And now we're being asked, is this actually hindering free movement? So it seems a bit absurd, I think, if you think about it initially. Okay, what did the European Court of Justice conclude? He said, we do not have a case of direct discrimination because the measure is applicable to all employees regardless of nationality. We do not have indirect discrimination because the measure, so only partially recognizing previous work experience, affects Austrian nationals and foreigners in the same way. So every person who seeks to take up employment at the University of Vienna and who has accumulated work experience of more than those 3 or 4 years will not have all of their work experience recognized. But this does not differentiate between on the grounds of nationality. Finally, and this was very surprising, at least for the Austrian government and for university employees, the European Court of Justice concluded that the internal regulation constitutes a restriction to the free movement of workers. He argued that applicants to the University of Vienna might be deterred from accessing the Austrian labor market because this internal regulation comes into effect right at the start of the employment relationship, so if it affects their remuneration immediately. And they might find that they do not get the same remuneration when they start their employment as employees who have accumulated the same years of work experience but who have always worked within the University of Vienna. And very quickly, the Austrian government tried to argue that the measure could be justified because we only wanted to award previous professional experience that is relevant. The University of Vienna argued that only the first 4 years of teaching experience lead to an improvement in teaching, and after that you just stop getting better as a university teacher. And not very surprisingly, the European Court of Justice has rejected this notion. He said, firstly, senior lecturers do more than just teaching. We also do research and administrative tasks. And this is then just my personal opinion. We don't stop accumulating experience. Hopefully, most of us get better the longer we teach. Most of us, not all of us. Like, nobody present in this room. Okay. So on this slide, I had initially prepared some of the most important parts. I'd like to skip over it. The one thing that is very important is the consideration that the European Court of Justice had in his wording of the paragraph 49. I've already mentioned it, but I just want to put it up once again. In this paragraph, the European Court of Justice has said, the recognition of all equivalent professional experience for workers who are nationals of other member states and want to come to the University of Vienna has to lead to the same working conditions as workers who perform the duties of postdocs for equivalent periods of service at the University of Vienna. And this wording was very strange. It has been widely criticized in Austria because what we believe has happened is that the European Court of Justice has effectively combined those two different and independent national provisions, the past experience rule and the seniority rule, and he has combined them in effect, and he said, if you read them together, so once again, this constitutes a restriction to the free movement of workers. And in my opinion, and also in that of my colleagues, at least the Austrian ones that I spoke to, we said that the European Court of Justice, had he evaluated each of these rules separately, there would have been a possible justification to each of them. So with the past experience rule, here we're looking again at the internal regulation of the University of Vienna. It only seems reasonable that we're saying we're doing something good for researchers from abroad who are coming to Austria. We want to get them a higher remuneration. This serves as an incentive, so we will get the best potential employees that we can get. This would have been a possible justification. With the seniority rule, so here we're looking at the collective agreement where we're saying, like, you know, the longer you stay with the same university, higher your remuneration gets. Again, there's a possible justification, and that is obviously company loyalty. Because if you work with the same employer, your work gets more valuable for him over time because he can access the labor force better. So yeah, again, the European Court of Justice constituted a restriction. It could not be justified, and this has had quite an interesting effect in Austria, because due to this judgment, all Austrian universities now fear that they might be in breach of Article 45, and they've decided to recognize all previous experience, not only of new employees, but also of the employees who are already working at the university. For me personally, this was very nice, because I got more money. For the universities as a whole, I think it's only, obviously this is cost intensive, and it has led to the universities not hiring as many staff as they did before. And with the last 2 minutes, I would just like to highlight that we had a very similar case in Germany that was being brought before the European Court of Justice. Here we were looking at a school teacher, and she had teaching experience in France. When she came back to Germany, there is one provision in the applicable collective agreement where the European, which basically contained the phrase that the land of Lower Saxony, so that's one of the provinces in Austria, in Germany. I'm sorry, definitely not Austria. In Germany, if they have a teacher coming in from abroad, the land of Lower Saxony has to recognize the teaching experience as equivalent or not. And once they have recognized the teaching experience as equivalent, the next step is in determining how many of those years will be recognized for her remuneration. And the funny thing in this collective agreement was that they said, we are saying that the teaching experience is equivalent, but at the same time, if you have accumulated it abroad, only 3 years will be recognized for the remuneration. If instead you have spent all your time within the land of Lower Saxony, you get the full previous professional experience recognized. And very quickly, the European Court of Justice said this is again a restriction. It could not be justified. It was interesting for me as a researcher because the land of Lower Saxony and the German government used the same two justifications that I have described to you. And now we've already reached the conclusions. 2 more slides, then we are done. So you see that in Austria, we're currently facing a different type of problems. We want to get people to come from abroad. We want to get the best possible university personnel, and now in my opinion, a very good internal regulation has been found to violate Article 45, so we still have to navigate our way around this. I think, however, that the European Court of Justice was right in the case of land of Lower Saxony. So if we decide to recognize previous professional experience, we should not be able to differentiate between where this professional experience comes from. And the last slide, I was looking specifically at those two justifications, and I think that we can employ both judgments to further develop our understanding of those justifications. But I think I'll just, at this point in time, refer to the written submissions, and if this is interesting to you, I hope you will read the book. Thank you very much for your attention.